said, I'm going to move on to talk about the Roaring Twenties, of course, which, of course, when they use that term, Roaring Twenties, you know, um, it doesn't really start roaring till later. I think like 1923 is when it really got started, but usually the 1920s or 20, I guess 2029, if you want to call it that, the Roaring Twenties. They dub it that. It's a very famous period that later has a very big prosperity, but it's also known for its different kinds of culture that they have, jazz and flappers, which you kind of see there, I guess, in the picture there, the flappers behind me and all of that. Automobile becomes big the country. Baseball becomes real big. You heard of Babe Ruth, right? A guy named Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic Ocean. So all these famous things, happen. Harlem Renaissance, you may have heard of that too. All happened, in the 1920s. So let me go ahead and, of course, first, of course, talk about the Roaring Twenties. Like I said, it wasn't roaring first. That is something that is, of course, very well known about the Roaring Twenties. It didn't start out that way. It wasn't all roaring. In fact, they went through a post-war depression after the war ended, which probably went on for like a year or so between 1918 to 1919. And of course, the years that really are more peaked in the whole Roaring Twenties was more like 23 to 29, like I'm saying about that. Before I get into that, I want to talk about what happened in the 1920 election. That's really the first thing, I guess, that happens, if you want to call it, in the 1920s. And I'll get more into other stuff also later with that. So you got the 1920, in the 1920 election, the Democrats tried to make the whole issue of that election about the Treaty of Versailles. Because back when I was talking about the previous lecture, Woodrow Wilson had tried to get it ratified. They didn't want to do it. The Senate didn't want to do it, which is controlled by the Republicans. They didn't want to get involved in Europe's problems, which they thought they would be directly involved after the war, 20s, 30s, or whatever. They didn't want to really get directly involved with the League of Nations at that point. Yeah, that was. They thought that would be a big issue and all that, but turned out it wasn't. I think most Americans were like, we're tired of that war. We want to move on, and all that. I'll kind of talk the Republicans. Yeah, the Republicans, they wanted to return to normalcy, like normal times. I think a lot of people feel like now, with the virus, I wish we could go back to just the way it was before, forget what happened. Virus, what virus? It's kind of like that, I guess the same thing. They want to get back to restoring America to peacetime, reject all the problems in Europe that they got going on and concentrate on America first. And that's kind of how a lot of people felt about it. Some people feel like that now, wish they could, who cares about what Europe and China and all these other countries, are basically doing. We need to focus more on our country, which is more important than the rest of the world. I kind of feel the same way too, also as well about it. Talk about the presidential election. Of course, the guy that ran, of course, we'll see later who becomes president, is Warren G. Harding. Of course, Harding is, I'll get to him later more about him. He, of course, turns out to be one of the most corrupt presidents in American history. They think, like he's probably in the top 5, maybe, because they have a lot of scandals under him, which are kind of a problem. So Harding is a Republican. He was a former senator, or he was a senator at the time, running. And James Cox also was a governor. He was a Democrat. Both were from Ohio, by the way, which is interesting. The 2 guys running from Ohio. That's kind of weird, but they were. I think Harding, he didn't really want to talk much about, Treaty of Versailles, ratifying it and all that stuff. If you know much about Harding, of course, and all of that, Harding, he wanted to concentrate more on America and what we need to do in this country. And Harding's the one that coined that term, which is return to normalcy. You may have heard about this. It was from a speech he gave in 1920. He said that America's need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not agitation, but adjustment, not surgery, but serenity, not the dramatic, but the dispassionate. So he basically, we need to move on. Forget World War I. We need to, continue building this country. Also, forget progressivism. That was another thing too. They forget progressivism. They wanted to do away with that too. Just move on. The way things were before the war. And Harding won. He won in a landslide. 64% of the vote, 404 electoral votes. James Cox only got 128 electoral votes. So pretty big. And so, from there, from 1921 to I think like 1933, the Republicans will control the White House for quite a long time. So, but I'll get later into Harding. There's a bunch of scandals that come out after he dies in office in 1923, which I'll get to later. This VP, Calvin Coolidge, of course, of Massachusetts, becomes the president later. We'll talk about that, but a lot of it won't really come out until about 1924. So I'll get more into that. But I want to go ahead and move on. I want to first talk about what happened after the war. Here's a kind of a map. You can see that Cox still got a lot of the southern states with that. But get into some things that happened. Of course, some things that happened right after the war, post-World War, of course, era, was that they had like a lot of the wartime industries had a problem after the war. Basically, the war ended. You had all these, stuff they had built for the war, tanks, and airplanes and whatever stuff for the war, weapons and so on. Well, they didn't need all of it. They had to convert back to peacetime production. And so this caused a lot of business and factories having to change over to peacetime. So they had to fire a lot of people while they converted over and all this. And so a lot of people lost jobs. So thousands of people were out of work between 1918 and about 1919. It's a debate about whether it was a recession or a depression. It's kind of a debate about it. Severe depression, severe recession, at least it was. And a lot of the veterans returning from World War I, they couldn't find jobs either. They got a couple million, 2 or 3 million coming back, from France, whatever. Farm prices then fell too. So farmers, a lot of the farmers lost their land. I think up to 500,000 farmers may have lost their land. Price of wheat is an example, which had been $2.26 a bushel during wartime, dropped to $1 a bushel. Whoa, that's a pretty drastic drop. Also, average wages fell. Oh, and the cost of living went up too as well. Cost of living in 1919 went up 77%, went up 28% in 1920. So by 1920, the cost of living had gone up over 100%. So the cost of living is going up too, and wages weren't going up. So into this mix came, of course, strikes. A lot of workers went on strike because they weren't making enough money, or they had bad, working hours, working conditions, and all that. And so they up to 4 million workers at one point went on strike, with the peak year being 1919. Back in 1919, there were actually 3 major strikes in the United States, which may have been almost that many people, workers that went on strike. I'll go through them real quick here, but first one was the Boston police strike in 1919. That one happened around September of 1919, What happened was the Boston police went on strike. Why? They wanted higher wages. They wanted better improved conditions for them as police. And what happened was it caused rioting, where you saw, like just recently, all these riots going on where people vandalizing, taking stuff out of stores, stealing stuff. Same thing happened 1919. Yeah, people started looting and stuff. And so the governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, had to call out what was basically the National Guard, basically to stop it. And it made him a big hero. If you know about this Calvin Coolidge, for putting it down, he basically fired the Boston police force, fired them all, and basically rehired new police. And Coolidge made a famous statement about that. He said about the Boston police strike, he said, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." He usually, if you know about Calvin Coolidge, he didn't say much. He was called Silent Cal, which I'll get to later about him. So he would later, become president because of that, because Harding would die in office and then Calvin Coolidge would take over. The other one had the United Mine Workers went on strike. Remember him? We talked about him before. He went back to the time of Teddy Roosevelt. John L. Lewis, he was the president of the UMW, United Mine Workers. Well, they went on strike, but not just last time it was like Pennsylvania. This time, the whole country, all the mine workers went on strike. This happened in the winter, November of 1919, which is like a bad time, to go on strike because everybody needs coal, and stuff like that. What they wanted higher wages. They wanted a shorter work week. That's what they wanted. Some of them were kind of working like 6-7 days a week and long hours. And it eventually led to them getting a raise. I think they got like a 27% raise eventually, but they didn't get a shorter work week until a few years later. So they went on strike. And then they also had one more strike. They had an AFL steel strike, American Federation of Labor. They went on strike too. When was that? That was in September of 1919 as well. 300,000 or so steel workers across the United States went on strike. They wanted better working conditions, higher wages. They wanted shorter work week. And the worst strike you see there happened in Gary, Indiana. Actually, the strike got so bad that it got violent. They had to call out the National Guard again, and they actually declared martial law there in Indiana. So, these strikes were pretty bad that were going on throughout the country. So you had all this labor arrest that was going on, throughout the country overall. Also, wanted to mention another thing that was very famous about, of course, this period as well in the early 20s. There was also this thing you may have heard about called the Red Scare. I want to talk about, the Red Scare. And there's, of course, had been two Red Scares. They got the first Red Scare, one that happened like right after World War I. There's a second one later that's called the Second Red Scare. That one happened at the beginning of the Cold War, like late 40s, early 1950s. They call it McCarthyism, I think, also as well later. But there was a period of paranoia, mass hysteria in the United States that communists or socialists were going to take over the country. Some people think that might happen today. You got a lot of radicals like Antifa out there that are kind of left-wing that want to take over the country, and they want to get rid of capitalism. That's their main goal overall. And they've tried this multiple times. Like communists or socialists have been trying to take over the country for like over 100 years. It's true. You can go back to like Eugene Debs, who wanted to get rid of capitalism a long time ago as well. The peak of it was 1919 and 1920. It started because of the fact that in Russia, if you know what happened in Russia, first talk about what happened. The Woodrow Wilson administration, starting in 1919, started conducting raids to basically arrest anyone that was considered to be kind of radical, socialists, communists, or anarchists. It was all done by Woodrow Wilson's attorney general named Mitchell Palmer. And if you know about it, they call it the Palmer raids, where they basically arrested people, jailed people for different radical ideas. And there was a case where a bunch of people were actually sent to the Soviet Union. There was a deal where you may have heard the story where they got a ship. They called it the Red Ark. You heard of the Red Ark? It was a ship that left, I think, in 1920, I think it was. And they shipped all these radicals to the Soviet Union, a bunch of them. And I probably got a rude awakening, when they got there. So it wasn't all panned out to be Soviet Union later. And the Palmer raids occurred because there was a fear of these radicals taking over the country, not just here, but around the world. The Bolsheviks, who were later you could call them communists, seized control of Russia during the Russian Revolution. They tried to do it in Germany too, like the so-called German Revolution after World War I. I think in 1919 they tried to take over Germany. They tried to take over Italy, 1919, but Mussolini seized power, the fascists, and they took power over the communists. I think Spain, it was a threat too. The communists trying to take over. And so, yeah, all this is kind of like part of the so-called Red Scare. And it also caused a lot of nativism in the country where people hated certain immigrants that were coming to the country, like especially Italians and Irish that were Catholic and things like that. And what happened? It saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan came back. It made a comeback after World War I, about the 1920s. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was more of a nativist type movement, anti-immigrant, basically anti-immigrant movement. And it was also anti-Catholic as well, probably anti-Jewish, more than say anti-black or whatever, like it was before maybe. And thing about the Klan back then, the 20s, it spread all over the country. The original Ku Klux Klan, which was in Reconstruction, it was mostly in the South, like in the southern states. But this Ku Klux Klan spread all over the United States. It was in the South, it was in the North, it was out west, Northwest. So it was all over the country, the Ku Klux Klan. I forget the number it peaked at, but it was somewhere like, I think in 1924, that the membership in the Ku Klux Klan may have been over 4 million people. You can even watch video. I won't show it today, but you can watch video like on YouTube of actually Ku Klux Klan rallies, not just all over the country, but marching through Washington. There's actually they had a march through Washington, D.C. That's how powerful they were in the 1920s. So just kind of talking about some of these things that happened, in the Red Scare period that also occurred. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, anti-immigrant thing that was the thing that really started with the Red Scare more than, because starting in like the late 19th, early 20th century, you start seeing a lot of these different kinds of immigrants come to the country that had never really come much before. Most of the immigrants that came before were in the western part, like German, French, maybe some of the English, Scots, whatever. But starting at the turn of the 20th century, you start getting a lot of people from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe that start coming in. Their culture is a little different and religion's different, and it caused a lot of strife, of course, between different groups in the country. Now, they had this incident that happened that's very famous with the Red Scare period as well, that we're talking about. And it was about these two communists named Sacco and Vanzetti. I think I've got their names. Nicola Sacco, Bartholomew Vanzetti. They were both Italian. They were also anarchists, apparently, as far as I know. What happened was they, in I want to say around 1920, they were arrested for supposedly trying to rob a shoe factory in Massachusetts. Shoe factory. I don't know if they're getting the money or the shoes. And Braintree, Massachusetts. I think it's near Boston, I guess. And anyway, they got arrested. They murdered a guy that was, I think, a security guard or something like that. And of course, they were brought to trial, and it became known as the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, that they dubbed it. And apparently, the judge and the jury were very prejudiced against him. So they gave him a very unfair trial. I think it was a very quick trial also as well. And the judge and a lot of the jury didn't like them because they were Italian immigrants. They were Catholic. And so they ended up, of course, being found guilty. And then what happened was they were sentenced to death, to be executed later. Eventually, they were executed in 1927. And many think they were innocent. Although, actually, I think I've studied about this before, but I think they may have found evidence that one of them may have done it. They may have actually have done it. So who knows? But they really received an unfair trial, though. I think the judge, I think there was a case where in the actual trial, he said that you're just a bunch of damn dagos, or something. He used a slang term for Italians, but that's what the judge said, that they're a bunch of dagos and damn dagos. So they weren't treated very well, So kind of a sad story, I guess, about that, innocent or not. Also, they had something else I'll just mention briefly about that's very famous. I guess because, you got people teach now Darwinism pretty easy now today, like in a biology class. But in 1925, that was not a good idea, by the way, to teach that. If you know about the Scopes trial, somebody called it the monkey trial, Scopes monkey trial. Basically, it was a famous court case that occurred where a teacher, John T. Scopes in Tennessee, was found guilty of teaching Darwinism, Charles Darwin and all that. And it went to trial, and it became a sensation. And anyway, he was eventually found guilty because it tested some act called the Butler Act or something like that forbid it. You had to teach creationism or something like that, religious stuff. And so he actually ended up being found guilty of it and went to prison, and he was a big sensation. And a guy named William Jennings Bryan, I think, was involved in the case, and another guy named Clarence Darrow. They were famous for being involved in it in the trial. They went against each other, but Scopes ended up being found guilty and all that. Then, of course, the big thing that happened, in the 1920s, which, of course, the short little video at the beginning, talked about was, of course, the country went dry, with prohibition of alcohol, which was quite a shock that the United States actually did this big experiment, social experiment, which it was. So starting in 1920, because of the 18th Amendment, which was ratified January 1919, I think it went into effect 1920. It was all because of mostly two things, what happened. One was the temperance movement, which we talked about before, all these women, mostly in religious groups, that wanted to ban alcohol because it was such a big problem in the country. People drinking too much, husbands, getting drunk and, I guess, losing their job and all that. And then, of course, World War I happened too. That was another reason why they banned alcohol, because they wanted to save all the grain to feed like troops and people in Europe that needed it. So that's the other reason why they, of course, did it as well. And of course, they had a nickname for Prohibition, which lasted from around 1920 to 1933. They call it the Noble Experiment, which it was. It was an experiment. And it only made the drinking problem worse. It actually did. In fact, made people want it more. I guess when something's illegal, people want it more. So I think after they made it legal, the amount of people that drank actually dropped. It's kind of funny about that. I guess it's kind of like the drug problem today. I guess if they made it legal, it wouldn't be as big of a problem, maybe. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But that anyway, the 18th Amendment itself, it prohibited the making, the selling, and the transporting of alcohol throughout the United States. Funny thing about the 18th Amendment, didn't say anything about drinking it. Just kind of stupid. But anyway, because of it, you then had this deal where there were different sides, that were for and against it. I think most people in the end wanted to keep it. I want to saw somewhere, I think close to 80% of people actually wanted to keep alcohol, not get rid of it. It's mostly a minority, more or less. And people were divided into what they call wets versus those that were called dries. If you were a wet, that meant that you basically wanted alcohol. A lot of the groups that wanted to keep it were mostly certain religious groups that had it in their religion. Like I think mostly the two main groups that wanted to keep it the most were the Catholics and the Jews, because they use it in their religious services, like their communion. They've got the wine. The Jews have something like that too, where they use it like the Kiddush. You may have heard of the Kiddush, and they use it for Sabbath, Passover, stuff like that. So I think you could use it for religious reasons, I believe, which led to a lot of people wanting to get sacramental wine a lot for some reason. I think I told you about my grandfather being a pharmacist. I imagine he could get a lot of wine or alcohol somehow, I guess, being a pharmacist and all that. Wonder about that one. But anyway, they also have what they call the Volstead Act. They passed that to Congress in October of 1919. It was originally called the Prohibition Enforcement Act. It was passed by this guy named Andrew Volstead, who was a representative of Minnesota in the U.S. Congress. And what it did was it actually was the main act that enforced prohibition federally across the country. So you have like the Prohibition Bureau that would try to stop people from making alcohol or transporting it and all that. It also defined what alcohol was, which is 0.5% of alcohol or more. All that. So yeah, so it even defined what it was, and so on. So here's a kind of a thing here. So you got these different groups. You have those on one side, and the other. So yeah, a lot of your religious groups wanted it. And of course, a lot of your religious and reformers wanted to get rid of it. And of course, criminals, would make a lot of money off of this. We'll get to that in a second, but it creates a lot of organized crime in the country trying to get illegal liquor or making illegal liquor. And so it led to a lot of lawlessness and criminals rising in the 1920s, which we'll get more into, of course, later. Of course, the first thing that happened because of, illegal alcohol, you had the illegal bars that were created at the end of the war, when they prohibited alcohol, and they are called a speakeasy. These secret bars, which sprouted up by the thousands. I forget how many were in New York or Chicago, but there must have been thousands of these illegal bars that were in buildings and basements and so on. And a lot of times you had to know somebody or know a password to get in. And I think when you would approach the door, they would say "speak easy," and you'd have to, I guess, tell them what the password was to get in. They actually had these low-end dives that they had that some people went to get alcohol as well, which were called either a blind tiger or a blind pig. And that was a deal where you got to see some kind of freak show, like a weird animal. He's got a missing eye. And what they would do is they'd give you'd buy a ticket to see the animal, and they'd give you some alcohol, basically. So poor people also drank different things like moonshine. That became a big thing around that time, which, you saw it in the rural areas like Tennessee, wherever, Kentucky. Bathtub gin. People started making gin in their bathtub, which a lot of times could make you go blind. Even they had this stuff called Jamaican ginger extract, which actually had some synthetic stuff in it. They called it Jake, is what they called it, I think, for short. People sometimes drank that too. And it would actually make your limbs go. You go paralyzed from some kind of synthetic stuff in it. Pretty awful. They call it Jake leg. People who got like paralyzed from it, and they couldn't move their arms and legs much and stuff. It's pretty awful. So kind of talk about all this illegal alcohol. And some people began, of course, trying to bring it into the country. And so you get the word rum runner, bootlegger, those kind of terms for people that brought illegal alcohol into the country. People don't know about this, but the Kennedys, like John F. Kennedy and all that, the Kennedy family, that's how they made their money, supposedly, was through bootlegging, bringing in probably Irish whiskey or whatever, like Joseph P. Kennedy. You've heard of him, the father of John F. Kennedy and all that. But the bootleggers, they became synonymous with organized crime, illegal liquor, cities like New York, Chicago, etc. Of course, the most famous character associated with, of course, illegal booze, he practically built an empire on it, was, of course, the guy named Scarface, Al Capone. Heard of him, right? Scarface. And Al Capone, who was originally from New York, came to Chicago and eventually built by the 1920s and 30s, basically an organized crime empire. He's pretty much the guy that started organized crime, they think, which later is called different names. People call it the mob or mafia, or La Costa Nostra, I think they called it too later as well. Mostly as Sicilian Italian immigrants were the ones that started the mafia in the country. And Chicago over time became a lawless city, kind of like now. Chicago, constantly got people getting shot every weekend. Seems like 20, 30 people. Kind of like back then, they would constantly shoot people, usually each other, gangsters. And it was pretty violent because they didn't just have guns. They had like Tommy guns and stuff, and submachine guns and stuff like that, which could make things very violent. And peak of the violence, I know, in the Prohibition era was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where in Chicago a bunch of gangsters were killed probably by Al Capone. So Capone later, the reason why he got taken down was because there's Capone right there, but Capone got taken down for not paying his taxes, which is kind of funny about that. And you may have heard of Elliot Ness. He worked for the federal government in the Prohibition Bureau, I believe, at the time. He helped bring down Capone for not paying his taxes. Brought him down in 1932 and led to a trial where he eventually went to prison for most of his life after that. And of course, they made movies about it. You may have seen the Untouchables, which is a movie with Sean Connery, Kevin Costner, which is pretty famous and I think made in the 1990s. It's a pretty good movie. I think they made a TV series about it called The Untouchables. I think it's a black and white one, I thought. But yeah, Capone, it's pretty vicious. But they had they had the Italian mafia, they had the Irish mafia, they even had the Jewish mafia. I think one of my uncles may have been. I don't think you may have been in the Jewish mafia, because I know he had like a nightclub and all that. May have told you about. He may have been in the Jewish mafia, likely. I think he knew some people, had connections and all that. And a lot of those nightclub owners are always in the mafia and stuff. But anyway, Prohibition, though, would eventually come to an end after about 12, 13 years. And Prohibition would eventually end, of course, in 1933, all because of Franklin D. Roosevelt came to power during the Great Depression. They pretty much had enough of it. But you can see Al Capone may have made millions off of illegal alcohol. $60 million, no taxes. God, what is that today? It's got to be ridiculous amount of money now, like 300-400 million now amount of money. So, but it ultimately failed. The whole thing was, like I said, a social experiment, which didn't work out. And In the end, the 21st Amendment, of course, would actually end prohibition. So it took another amendment to repeal it, and all of that. But the interesting thing about prohibition is that it left some things behind, if you know about this, which is interesting about prohibition. If you go back up here and show you again, but it did have a case where after the prohibition ended, you have this case where you have these dry counties. I don't know if you've ever been to a dry county somewhere in the country, but you got this deal where some counties won't sell alcohol. It's a remnant of prohibition and all that. So that's where it comes from. Yeah. So yeah, and then some places they'll sell alcohol, but they'll sell it in what they call an ABC store, like a specific alcohol store and all that. And you can't buy it like in a regular store. It's weird how they do that. But that's kind of remnants, I guess, left over from the Prohibition era and all of that. Like you can't buy alcohol on Sunday, which they used to have for a long time too, as well. Let me talk about one more thing, and I think that's it for this lecture today. Let's talk about also the Harding scandals. Harding, that was another thing happened. Harding, of course, came in 1921, and he proved to be one of the worst scandalous presidents in history. He may have been one of the worst presidents ever in American history, probably in the top 5 or top 10 worst presidents we ever had. He's only in power for like 2 years or so. One of the worst scandals he had, you see that picture up there, was the so-called Teapot Dome scandal, which involved his Secretary of Interior, who was from New Mexico, Albert B. Fall. And anyway, after Fall came in, I think in 1921, what he did was he took what are like oil reserves that the United States had, and he basically allowed oil companies to come in and basically take the oil in return for money. And the amount of money he got in bribes was like $385,000, which I don't know what that is now today, but it's got to be worth 3 times, probably at least worth $1 million or more dollars now today. And what happened was he got investigated by the U.S. Senate August of 1923. He was actually convicted and sentenced and served 1 year in prison for it. I think they even foreclosed on his house, and I think they took the money back, I think. And so he became Albert Fall was one of the first actual cabinet officers in American history to actually go to prison for doing something wrong. It's very interesting about that. What happened to Albert Fall? So that was one scandal that was very famous as well. So it's kind of talking about all these scandals that they had right here. They also had what they call the Ohio Gang, what I want to mention too. The Ohio Gang. Ohio Gang was a bunch of politicians and industry leaders that were kind of around Harding in his administration. They were kind of corrupt, and they had a lot of influence on Harding and other people, and they were involved in a lot of financial scandals in the country where they took money, all that. One of the guys you see there in that picture is the Attorney General under Harding, which is Harry Daughtry, and he was famous for helping out bootleggers who were violating the Volstead Act in the 18th Amendment, and he kind of looked the other way. I think in exchange maybe for money or whatever, political power and so on. And so he was famous for doing that as an example. They also had another guy named Charles Forbes, who was head of the VA, the Veterans Administration. He basically took a bunch of money from the VA, like hospitals and so on, siphoned off money, which may have been like $200 million or more dollars. He wasn't found out till later, and he was fired for it also as well. So all these were various scandals that happened in the early 1920s. And a lot of these scandals, by the way, didn't really come out until about 1924, or maybe even 1925 as well. And so, yeah, a lot of it comes like when Calvin Coolidge was president. That's when you start hearing about all this stuff going on. Like when Coolidge was running for president, it comes out, at the end of 1924. But by that time, if you know what happened, Warren G. Harding was dead. he had died in office. And Harding had been on this business trip to Alaska to see. Here's some more pictures of the scandal and all that Teapot Dome scandal. And they call it Teapot Dome because there's this thing in Wyoming that looks like a teapot where the oil was. So they got the name from it, all that. But anyway, he had gone to Alaska. He was coming back and he fell ill. And the Surgeon General, the highest doctor in the land, U.S. government, thought he had food poisoning. He wasn't something else. Well, of course, he stops off in San Francisco, and of course, they find out it's not food poisoning, but he's having a heart attack, and he dies August 2nd, 1923. And so because of Harding dying in office, that allows, of course, like I said, Calvin Coolidge, who's his vice president, he would become president in 1923. He takes over from Massachusetts. He'll be president from 1923 to 1929. And he's really the president when they have the Roaring Twenties, which I'll, of course, get to later and all that. That wasn't it about Harding. There are other rumors that Harding was having a bunch of affairs with different women. That wasn't his wife. This is sounds like John F. Kennedy and all that. And apparently there were at least two women that he may have had an affair with that they know about. There was one woman named Nan Britton who was his secretary in the White House. He had an affair. It sounds like that Monica Lewinsky thing, if I remember correctly, with Bill Clinton, same kind of deal. And they had another woman named Carrie Fulton, who he also had an affair with when he was a U.S. Senator in Ohio. She actually blackmailed him when he was running for president, 1920, and he had to pay her off to shut her up. There was another rumor that his wife, Florence Harding, poisoned him. And that's the reason why he died, because of all the affairs. I think there are stories where he was hiding the women in the White House. Like his wife would come around, he'd put her in a closet or something like that to hide his mistress and stuff like that. Crazy stories. But he was a terrible president. Warren Harding, thank God he died, I guess. And so Calvin Coolidge came in. And so we'll talk more about Coolidge later. He'll come, like I said, become president 1923 to 1929. I think I'm gonna stop here for now, and I'll get later, of course, with the rest of the Roaring Twenties. It's a good place to stop on the Roaring Twenties. I'm going to get in the next lecture, which is next Tuesday, which I think looks like October 20th. I'll get into the Roaring Twenties culture. I haven't really done that yet. We'll talk about jazz and all that stuff that was kind of famous, in the Roaring Twenties. I'll probably wait till later to do that. And that's going to be it for that. And before I go, just remind you about various, assignments that are due this week. You look like you got two quizzes that are up that need to be completed this week. So try to get that done overall. And after this lecture, of course, like I said, I am going to post the video, of course, to my YouTube channel where you can watch it later. But yeah, that main quiz you need to do right now is that one on Teddy Roosevelt, Taft Wilson here. I know that one's up right now. And don't forget about the Spanish flu documentary video quiz that you need to do also as well. So that's it for today. I hope you all have a good weekend coming up. And if you let me know if you got any questions, like I said, about any of these lectures that have posted comments, questions. I'll take those through my YouTube channel. If you got a question about something, you can also email me if it's something else. So that's it for today. You all have a good weekend, like I said, coming up.